Hey, good afternoon to you. It's 5:07 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we are making sense of the news. Coming up this hour, the in-house economist for the Vince Coglianese Show, also an employee of my next guest, E.J. Antoni, is going to join us at 5:30. We've got to talk about tariffs and the economy with him. And we'll chat with you at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Yes. My next guest is the president of the Heritage Foundation. Kevin Roberts is back on the program. He's the host of the Kevin Roberts Show. Excellent show. Kevin, good to have you with us, sir.
Oh, Vince, what a great day to be with you. We've got some news to talk about, but the best news of the day is when I heard this morning that you've got a new national show. And, as president of the Heritage Foundation, I would congratulate you about that anyway, because you're so good to us. But I really mean that as a friend, as a loyal listener. When anyone is on your show, you are just the best in the business, and heartfelt, my friend, for my family and me, just a great human being. I just couldn't be happier for you.
I'm so grateful for those words, Kevin. And, the Heritage Foundation is funny. I mentioned earlier, so I'll say it now just because I'm talking to you as the president of Heritage, that, Rush, this is Rush Limbaugh. These are Rush Limbaugh's hours. I stutter as I say it because it's a big deal. And when I was many years ago now at the Heritage Foundation as an intern, I was working away at gathering news and information there at Heritage in the communications department. And I had discovered while I was there that Rush had included my writing in his stack of stuff, his infamous stack of stuff, had linked directly to my writing at the Heritage Foundation while I was there. And it was one of the early honors of my life. I couldn't even believe that somehow something I had written had ended up on Rush Limbaugh's desk in his show prep. And that brought me to many years later. You just had your 50th anniversary of the Heritage Foundation, and you were kind enough to invite me to stand on that stage and reflect for a moment about the value that Heritage has had in this world. And I said, as I stood on that stage, that the reason so many of us even knew that the Heritage Foundation existed, Rush Limbaugh. And it is a great credit and a testament to his power and capability that so many people now turn to Heritage so routinely. So it's just an amazing series of events, and I can't thank you enough, Kevin.
Well, you're most welcome. Thank you for what you do. It's more evidence that this is a golden era in America when I turn on the radio, and my great friend Vince Coglianese is going to be in those very famous rush hours, which, of course, Dan Bongino did such a great job of filling in. We're just thrilled. We're thrilled for you.
Yeah, Dan's done an amazing job. All right, let's talk about tonight, the address to the nation from the president. He's going to be standing up in front of Congress, although it sounds like it might be half empty. Democrats either planning on protesting, being grumpy, or not showing up at all. What do you expect to hear from the president this evening, sir?
Just on offense all the time. And the Democrats who don't show up show they've got no argument to make. That was evidence in the campaign last year. But ultimately, what the president's going to lay out is an ambitious, bold agenda, a continuation of that agenda. The real trick for President Trump and his administration moving forward is to communicate well why and how they're doing what they're doing. For example, what happened in the White House on Friday with Mr. Zelensky, yesterday with the tariffs. Tonight is the opportunity for Trump to continue to maintain control, not just of the substantive agenda, but also of the communications agenda. And I think the Democrats haven't yet figured out how they can combat that. So it would not surprise me if many of them are absent.
Yeah, I mean, the president, I think Republicans have by and large learned their lesson that President Trump's instincts are typically right, even so far as even Lindsey Graham, of all people, came out over the weekend and said, man, that Zelensky really screwed up. He might have to go. And I'm sitting here going, man, well, of course Lindsey Graham's for regime change. Of course, that's his instincts. But even him, he responded to this, and he's looking at it going, we've got to trust President Trump here in this process. And I think Republicans, unless I'm wrong, they're learning that lesson in a bigger way these days.
Well, they are. As I told a friend of mine, I said, gosh, Zelensky's lost Lindsey Graham. I think all hope may be done for him as it relates to his political future. And one other example of this, and it will be telling in the coming days, is whether our friend Bridge Colby is able to get through the committee vote and the Senate confirmation, because he really personifies this shift in policy within the conservative movement that Republicans in D.C. generally but Republicans in the U.S. Senate specifically are slower to adapt to. And I mean that genuinely, respectfully of most of them. I think Mitch McConnell is a lost cause as it relates to that. But I think Bridge brings the substance, the policy heft to these instincts of Trump that usually are so spot on. It'd be really telling if the Senate Republicans, including Senator Tom Cotton, can come along and trust Trump's instincts and his judgment in appointing Bridge to that position.
So to the extent I've listened to some of his public remarks and his interviews, including with our friend Tucker Carlson, Elbridge Colby, and what I've been impressed by is that he's a lot like J.D. Vance, very bright, deeply knowledgeable, and an excellent communicator. And in speaking of the vice president, today he introduced Elbridge Colby to the United States Senate in his confirmation hearing, and here's what that sounded like.
To be here because I thought it was important to tell you all about my friend Bridge Colby and why I think he's important to the president's defense policy and important to what the president is trying to accomplish with national security. So first, I think Bridge, more than any person I've ever spoken to, appreciates that military power, national security influence is downstream of economic power. As we've seen in so many of the conflicts that we've engaged ourselves in over the last 30 or 40 years, we cannot fight wars unless our troops have the ammunition they need. We cannot defend our own national security unless we have the tank shells, the artillery shells, and increasingly the drones and other advanced weapon systems that are necessary to actually fight battles when, God forbid, those battles are necessary to fight. And I think Bridge has been particularly aware of and worried about the degradation of our defense industrial base and how we must rebuild it if we want to preserve our own national security.
So what J.D. Vance is saying here is not a blanket condemnation of the military-industrial complex. It is saying that we need to have an arsenal that's dedicated to the protection of America.
It is, and it's really common sense. I think so many members of the D.C. media, including some who call themselves conservatives, although they may be former conservatives, really are creating a false dichotomy, which is to say, if those of us on the political right, like Bridge, are talking about reform in the Pentagon, then therefore that must mean we are against a requisite amount of defense spending in this country. And in fact, what Bridge has said so eloquently, what the vice president said so well there, what Trump's instincts point us to, is that if in fact you want to create the lethal efficiency that we demand in our Pentagon, then you have to have people like Pete Hegseth and Bridge Colby creating that transition from the old way of fighting to the new way of fighting, and very respectfully of the senators who are still in sort of that old camp. This is the opportunity this week for them to listen to Bridge and understand what the vice president said so well, which is that even if you might have a slight difference of opinion with him, he's so intellectually honest and he's so virtuous. He is going to listen to you. He's going to try to understand your concerns, and he wants to develop with you a solution to these problems that are not partisan. They're certainly not ideological. They really rest upon, on behalf of the everyday American, developing the lethality in the Pentagon that it's been lacking for too long.
He's a sober guy, not an hysterical one. In fact, here he is presenting his view of the world today.
The position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is a role that comes with genuinely profound and grave responsibilities. And my nomination comes at a time, as this committee has eloquently laid out, of deep peril for our country. Peace and the protection of American interests in the world cannot be assumed. There is a real risk of major war, and we cannot afford to lose one. I recognize these realities in my bones. It is my great hope that we can get through the coming years peacefully, with strength, in ways that put us and our alliances on a stronger and more sustainable footing. If confirmed, I would do all in my power to make it so.
You know, under the Biden era, we were served all sorts of awful stories about what the left has been doing to the military that didn't focus on lethality and efficiency and winning wars. And I was always troubled when I saw those reports, Kevin Roberts, that in our own military's war games, that fights in the South China Sea did not end in American victory against China. And it sounds like Elbridge Colby is saying we need to build the ships, we need to build the human capital here, and we need to be ready to win wars should they arrive.
Oh, it's so true. I remember this time last year, I was in Taiwan with a handful of heritage colleagues, and these senior officials in Taiwan's government were telling us, by the way, very grateful for America's alliance with them, but they were telling us that in their own war games, they've been public about this in the last year, that it's not a 100% certainty by any stretch that the United States prevails in a confrontation with China. And so for the members of the Republican Senate Conference who, for whatever reason, have been a little skeptical of Bridge, maybe it's because they've consumed some D.C. media, which is trying to drive a wedge between his confirmation and their understanding of the truth. I would just say this very respectfully, and it's to your point, Vince. We are in a new era, not just in U.S. history, but in geopolitics. And in order for the United States to have some, or Americans to have some confidence that we can prevail in the next war, which most likely would be with China, the best way to do that is to update what we're doing at the Pentagon, not continue to fund the outdated programs that would have been very helpful if we were fighting the last war. The reality is we have to have men and women in the Pentagon now who are willing to challenge the status quo. The challenging of the status quo threatens some entrenched power interests on K Street in D.C. I would just encourage senators to have that conversation with Bridge, to trust not only him and Secretary Hegseth, but also, to the very point you made at the beginning of our conversation, trust the instincts and judgment of Donald Trump and Vice President Vance, who I think have proven that those instincts are usually right.
Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska asked Bridge Colby today whether or not he would root out the Marxism that has been disabling our military.
You work with this committee and Secretary Hegseth to stamp out the remaining remnants of the woke assault that we spent 4 years dealing with under Biden and his Undersecretary of Policy and everybody else?
Senator, I commit to you to work to and support of Secretary Hegseth, if confirmed, to restore a focus on lethality, readiness, meritocracy, and these kinds of values.
Good. I think that's the right focus, and our military is not systemically racist.
So no more racial prejudice in the military, no more abortion flights. We will focus on winning wars.
Imagine that. And God bless Senator Sullivan for asking such a great question. And the key thing is, I think by the end of this year, the end of this calendar year, most of those stupid, nefarious practices of the previous administration regarding DEI will be out of the way. And then we're going to really be able to get down to brass tacks and focus on near-term needs to update where we're spending our precious resources on in the Pentagon. And that's really where, inside our family on the political center right, there are some valid differences of opinion about priorities and so on. My point about Bridge is there's no better person I've come across outside Heritage, and our scholars at Heritage would say the same, who is more thoughtful, who is more sober in his analysis, and whom we should trust more to advise the Secretary and the President on those decisions about priorities than Bridge Colby.
Yeah, we need adults. Bridge is one. So are you. Kevin Roberts from the Heritage Foundation, president there. Sir, always nice to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Do you remember an hour ago when I told you that this deal, this mineral deal, may be a Beyonce thing? Reuters reporting that Ukraine and President Trump had reached a deal and it'll be announced tonight. Reuters said that. Maybe not. Jackie Heinrich at the Fox News Channel saying sources at the White House are saying this Reuters report is not true. There's been no movement on this yet. So, of course, that leads me to think, well, maybe they just don't want the cat to get out of the bag just yet. Maybe President Trump wants to announce this on his own timetable. Maybe it's not happening at all. Maybe it'll happen in the weeks and days ahead. But that's the latest on that. So Reuters with a big report. They're going to have a mineral deal, and President Trump's going to say it tonight. Jackie Heinrich at Fox saying, not true, according to the White House at this hour. So we're watching on that. Also, there was a big moment on The View today, which is always hilarious. Stephen A. Smith stopped by and apparently embarrassed the women of The View. I have not yet heard this clip, so I will enjoy it with you.
It's only been in office for 6 weeks. Seems like 6 years, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And he's been going around with his cronies touting his so-called landslide and blowout win. But he won the popular vote by one.
She's reading every element of this question.
0.5%, one of the smallest ever, and he won the general election by less than 50%. So what kind of mandate is this really?
Well, it is a mandate, and I'm going to explain why. And I don't mind the question, but let me be very clear. I'm no supporter of Trump. I'm a supporter of truth and the facts. And here's the facts. The man won every swing state. He increased in terms of his voter turnout in his favor from the standpoint of blacks, Latinos, and young voters. He increased his numbers in that regard from 2020. 89% of the counties shifted to the right. That's a mandate. We can sit up there and play around all we want to. In 2020, Trump didn't win the popular vote. He didn't win the electoral college vote. A matter of fact, the Republicans hadn't won the popular vote, if I remember correctly, since 2004. Yeah. But they did this year. So 20 years after they last won the popular vote, they won the popular vote. They won the electoral college vote. The man won every swing state. And on top of it all, 89% of the counties shifted gears. I don't understand how people can look at that and say, there's no mandate. There's a mandate.
Well, it's a different definition of a mandate, I guess.
But the problem is that if you're the Democratic Party and you lost 49.8% to 48.3%, and you're looking at that 1.5% dip, that's an excuse for you to say, what we did really wasn't that bad.
Amen.
We should continue to do that.
Amen. Amen. What a good point. Yeah, he's totally right about that. Totally right about that. They really are. It's excuse-making not to change course. And I'm here to tell you, I hope they don't change course. Stick to that strategy. Keep putting Jasmine Crockett out, saying that Donald Trump is an enemy to the United States, the duly elected president she's talking about. Coming up next, all this economic chaos. Everyone's so scared. What's going to happen with the tariffs? E.J. Antoni is the in-house economist of this program. He'll break it down next. Hey, good afternoon to you. 5:35 now, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us today at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Before we get to our next wonderful guest, I have Richard calling in from Manassas on line 1. Richard, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show. You're seeing protesters outside the Senate right now?
Yes. I was up on Capitol Hill earlier. I had a little business up there, and the I Stand with Ukraine protesters are already out there with their signs, their vulgar sayings, their call and repeat chants on the bullhorns. They're about, when I was up there about 4:30, it was maybe about 150. They seem to be filtering in already. So not a whole lot of them, but they're already out there being a nuisance.
Do you think they know they're marching for continued human suffering, or was this a low IQ crowd in your estimation?
They seem pretty low IQ. I mean, one guy, they totally do not know what they're talking about. One guy had a Ukrainian flag in one hand and a NATO flag in the other. Clearly, he does not understand that the moment Zelensky raises his pen off a NATO treaty, that he's going to invoke Article 5 and involve us in World War III.
Yeah, all this suffering needs to stop. And the people who are marching like that, they're World War III adherents, enthusiasts, whether they realize it or not. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, we'll keep an eye on that. We've seen some images outside of the Congress of people waving Ukrainian flags around. How about some American flags as the President of the United States takes the dais this evening? Let's check in now with our next guest to talk about what the president might address. Today is Tarriff Day. Happy Tarriff Day. As President Trump imposes 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico, and then an additional 10% on the many tariffs that he's imposed on China. Joining us now to discuss, the in-house economist of the Vince Coglianese Show and economist of the Heritage Foundation, E.J. Antoni. E.J., good to talk to you, sir.
Vince, you too. Kind of a slow news day in my world. I don't know about you. I don't know if you got anything going on.
It's been
today,
super
but,
slow.
It's just kind of same old, you know.
It's been super slow. Actually, you know, it's been such a fast news day for me. So much is going on that my iPhone battery just keeps running out. I have to keep plugging it back in. So it's been very busy today, EJ.
Well, congrats. I know everyone else has already said it, but I got to add mine to the list. Well deserved, my man.
Thank you very much. And for those who haven't heard all 3 hours of our program, you may have missed it. Starting March 17th, I will be taking over for the great Dan Bongino, 12 to 3 nationwide on his radio program. I'll also be taking the helm at the podcast that he does each day at 11 o'clock in the morning. That's all ahead. So we've got some busy weeks as we prepare and finally launch a very big show coming up. So thank you for that, EJ. And the nice thing, as I was saying earlier, is that you are billed by, but people may not realize this, but you're billed as the in-house economist by a lot of radio hosts now across the country. They've all taken this idea from me. They think that it's great that they have their own. But Dan also has you as his economist, so now I can at least consolidate that role for you and clean up your Twitter profile a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. We need some extra character room. So that's actually the whole reason behind this move.
Yeah.
It was to give me a little bit more wiggle room in my character
Totally.
count on my Twitter bio.
Totally.
So
We
thank
moved
you.
heaven and earth to adjust your bio. That was the key. Hey, tell me about Tariff Day. President Trump had promised this. He put a month delay on it in the first place, but now it's finally here. Contextualize this for us, because the way the media talks about it, President Trump is just a reckless psychopath. He's imposing tariffs on our allies and our neighbors and doing it for no reason whatsoever. What do you see?
Well, let me just look out the window real quick. And no, the sky is not yet falling. We are still okay. The apocalypse is not yet here. Look, Vince, one of the problems is that we essentially have more than an entire generation of brokers, of money managers, folks on Wall Street who were raised on this whole mantra of free trade no matter what. And it doesn't matter what your allies or enemies are doing, you should always reduce your tariffs, your non-tariff barriers, or don't have any at all. And that these things never serve any purpose. There's no right way to implement them. There's never a good time to implement them, et cetera. And so that's why you're seeing a market sell-off today, for example. That's why there's so much panic. And yet things have not come crashing down. Even during the first Trump administration, things did not come crashing down. In fact, if we look at the price indexes for imports, those actually fell after Trump implemented tariffs. So what I'm trying to say is this whole idea that it's going to be catastrophic, that tariffs are always bad, that they can never serve a good purpose, that's just not correct, neither according to economic history nor economic theory. McKinley was probably the most famous example of how to implement tariffs well. Hoover, obviously, is a great example of how not to implement them. Fortunately, I think Trump is much more in alignment with McKinley than he is with Hoover. So I'm actually very, very hopeful on how things are going right now.
One of the things that is never discussed is the role that trade barriers play in President Trump's judgment here. We've talked before, Canada, for instance, imposes some very big trade barriers, for instance, on American dairy products to prevent milk from arriving in Canada from America. President Trump has described some of this tariff activity as retaliatory. What part of this story isn't being told?
Oh, Vince, I'm so glad you bring this up, that it's not just tariffs. There are what we call non-tariff barriers here as well. And probably the best example of that is quotas. So if you look at all of the different tariff and non-tariff barriers that Canada puts on American exporters, so American producers, whether that's a dairy farmer or a factory worker trying to sell their output into Canada, what we find is that there is a roughly the equivalent of a 25% tariff rate on all American exports going into Canada. That's pretty stifling, especially when you consider that certain particular products, like you mentioned dairy, the barriers there are much, much higher than the average. And so it puts us at a tremendous disadvantage. It makes it very difficult for the American worker to actually get his output across our northern border and into Canada. So when Trump talks about a 25% tariff on Canada, which he has implemented, that didn't just get pulled out of thin air. He and his team are looking at what Canada is already doing to the American producer and is essentially trying to level the playing field. And we should remember that when Trump does something, he is not so, single focused in his sight. He may have multiple reasons for doing a single thing. So when it comes to tariffs, he's not only looking at this in terms of let's try to level the playing field. He's also looking at this as, this is another way to raise revenue. This is also a way that we can essentially try to force Canada's hand in terms of getting them to police their border, yes, so that we don't have so much fentanyl coming in, and also so that we don't have Chinese companies setting up shop in Canada and abusing the USMCA, whereby they are getting around the different barriers that we have put on Chinese trade, and they are, again, using that agreement that we made with Canada and abusing it to get products and dump them here into the United States at lower prices at which Americans simply can't compete.
So, I'm just looking at a basic search on this, and I know you're more steeped in the numbers than I am. It looks like the size of our economy is about 10 times the size of Canada's economy. If we make that same comparison with Mexico, it's pretty drastic as well. The United States with an economy of nearly $30 trillion GDP, Mexico just 1.79. So these are much smaller economies we're dealing with. In other words, it seems like they have a lot more on the line. The pain is going to be a lot more meaningful for them than it is for us. And is that the kind of thing that could compel a behavior change more quickly, especially when it comes to stopping that fentanyl from coming in?
I think so. And not only do we have that massive ratio that you were just talking about, that's about 10-1 in terms of overall economy, but if you look at the percentage of our exports that go to Canada, it's very small. Conversely, the percentage of their exports that come here is very large. Again, the ratio is about 10-1. It's something like 8% or so of our exports go there and 80% of theirs come here. So if you're really going to have a trade war, if you really want to go toe-to-toe, which would be very unwise doing that with President Trump, but if the governor of Canada really has his heart set on that, I say go ahead, because you're going to send your own country probably into a full-fledged recession, and over here it'll basically feel like an economic speed bump.
It is amazing, and obviously I think one of the big things that President Trump is looking for is a clear sign that fewer Americans are dying. I realize, like, the media, they pretend like it's not happening. We have over 100,000 Americans dying due to drug overdoses every year. It is a devastating scourge on our country. And President Trump seems to be dead serious about this, that he will impose these trade barriers until the deaths stop.
Oh, exactly. Again, this is where I think people have a difficult time understanding what's going on with the president's thinking here. Just because he is using the same tool doesn't mean he's not using it for different purposes in different instances. In fact, even sometimes in the same instance, he's using that tool for multiple purposes, one of which is exactly what you just said, to try to reduce the number of Americans dying from these drugs coming in overseas.
So on the economic front, obviously, all of the attention is paid on just the, like the S&P 500, for instance. The stock market is always the indicator that the media talks about, but they don't talk about all of the other economic impacts that exist. When I talked to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about this, about tariffs, he was saying that much of a tariff that is imposed by the United States is watered down when it comes to the impact on the American consumer, that by and large that they don't actually suffer much by way of increased prices when it comes to these tariffs. How do you assess that? What's the impact on the average American when President Trump levels tariffs against foreign countries?
This is where it goes back to this idea of how are you implementing the tariffs? Are you doing it in a scientific way like McKinley did, or are you doing it in an almost random or shotgun style the way Hoover did?
Right.
And it looks like what this administration is doing, whether you talk to somebody like Secretary Bessent or someone like Secretary Lutnick, or if you talk to the president himself, it sounds like it's much more of the scientific approach. They are paying close attention to things like, where do Americans have alternatives? So we're going to put these huge tariffs on Canadian lumber, for example, because we're sitting on a gold mine of lumber just in the Pacific Northwest alone. And so if Canadian producers turn around and try to pass on the full cost of these tariffs to their American consumers, what will the American consumer do? Well, they're simply just going to turn around and buy from more American producers, because at that point, the price charged by the American producer will be less than the price charged by the Canadian one.
E.J. Antoni, do you anticipate anything economic? Obviously, the president will discuss economics tonight. What are you looking for in his address to the nation?
I'm hoping that he does two things. First and foremost, that he reiterates just what bad shape we are in today, that he makes it very, very clear how much the American people have suffered over the last 4 years, because for those 4 years, we've been told that we weren't suffering at all. We were told, shut up and be grateful for how wonderful everything is and for how high the S&P is that you mentioned, right? And so I'm hoping he acknowledges Americans' pain, but then he also outlines his strategy for getting us out of this mess and tells us that, look, there is cause to be hopeful here. This is not going to last forever. We're going to get out of this.
I'm looking forward to it. I know you are, too. In the meantime, E.J. Antoni, in-house economist for the Vince Coglianese Show, and soon to be the in-house economist for the Vince Show. Where'd my last name go? Hey, thank you very much. Oh, as always, sir, good to talk to you.
Hey, Vince, my pleasure. Great to be with you, and congratulations again.
Thanks, man. So, I don't know if we can take full credit for it or not. But why not? Why don't we just take some credit for it? We'll take a little bit of credit at least. Black Lives Matter Plaza is going away. The news this hour, I see Fox 5's Jim Lokay pointing out, saying, breaking, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser says Black Lives Matter Plaza will be changed, becoming a part of a mural marking America's 250th birthday. What a nice change, huh? This comes as Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia is pushing a bill to strip D.C. of funds unless the name and the mural are removed. Corey, correct me if I'm wrong. We brought this up with the congressman, didn't we? Yes. Every time we talked about, hey, D.C.'s being run very poorly. Also, sidebar, when are you getting rid of the graffiti on the ground in front of the White House? And now it looks like Muriel Bowser is making a move to do that. She issued a statement today. Statement from Mayor Bowser on the evolution of Black Lives Matter Plaza. Even the announcement is squirrely. The evolution. We have long considered Black Lives Matter Plaza's evolution, and the plaza will be a part of D.C. America's 250th mural project, where we will invite students and artists to create new murals across all eight wards. How about no paint on the ground? How about, I want to celebrate America, put 1,000 American flags all over the place. How about no paint on the ground? Just open up the street to vehicular traffic so people can drive down it and see the White House as they are in the nation's capital. That street is one of the most epic approaches ever to come down the street and look right at the White House. And she ruined it. The mural inspired millions of people, she lies, and helped our city through a very painful period. She once again lies. It was a ransom payment to the rioters. But now we can't afford to be distracted by meaningless congressional interference. The devastating impacts of the federal job cuts must be our number one concern. All right, I've had enough from you. John is calling in from Leesburg on line 8. John has been waiting very patiently. Let's see if he's on the phone. Hello, John. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Hey, Vince, congratulations. I know you're going to be very successful, and I'll tell you why. My wife has been indoctrinated for decades and decades by The View. And twice a week, we drive from Dulles Airport out to Leesburg. And on the way out, we catch Dan in one of his rant and raves about stupid Democrats, dumb congressmen, idiotic senators. She'll say, turn the station.
Oh.
Later in the afternoon, we'll come back from Leesburg, going home, and you'll be on the same subject that Dan was talking about. But your common sense, humorous, and factual discussion, she'll look at me and she said, that guy knows what he's talking about, and Congress should do something about changing the issue.
That's what we call a 1-2 punch. That's So Dan hits her early, and then I come back later, and we finish it off. That's a really nice compliment, John. I'm over the moon about the news today that I'll be stepping into that role, 12-3 nationwide. Dan has done such a fantastic job there, and I'm just grateful to you, John, and everyone else who listens.
I know you're going to be really successful.
You're a good man. Thank you. And tell your wife that I said hello. And please ask her to listen between 12 and 3. We kick things off March 17th. I've got a lot more to tell you about that, so I will. Trust me, we'll talk about that. The great one, Mark Levin, up next on the legendary WMAL.